The test was supposed to take 40 minutes. It took 11. Not because it was efficient, because it was over. 8 years of development, 12,000 engineers across 19 facilities. A budget the program office had reported to Congress as necessary, justified, and on track, failed in a manner so complete that the officer responsible for writing the after-action report initially refused to sign it. Not because the report was inaccurate, because he understood that signing it meant the report would be read, and that once it was read, a decision would follow that nobody in the program was prepared to confront. The decision that followed cost the United States Air Force $40 billion. The report that triggered it was buried for 18 months before an unrelated audit surfaced it, and the system that allowed a program to consume $40 billion while producing something that an 11-minute test proved didn't work is not a story about corruption. It is a story about something more dangerous than corruption, something that is still happening right now in programs you have never heard of. But to understand why $40 billion disappeared, you first have to understand the world that made it possible, the specific institutional environment that turns individually rational people into collectively catastrophic decision-makers. Because every single person involved in this program made decisions that made sense in context. And the context is the most important part of the story. The program had its origins in a genuine strategic requirement. By the late 1980s, Soviet and Russian air defense systems had evolved to a point where the assumptions built into existing American strike aircraft were no longer valid. Radar cross-sections that had once been acceptable were now detectable at ranges that made mission survival in high-threat environments unacceptable. The Air Force needed a fundamental step change, not an improvement. A new category of capability, a platform that could penetrate the most sophisticated air defense environments on Earth, deliver precision weapons against hardened targets, and return. The program that was designed to deliver this was genuinely ambitious. Its technical requirements were at or beyond the edge of what existing engineering knowledge could reliably achieve. And rather than adjust the requirements to match what was achievable, the program adjusted its timeline, and then adjusted it again, and then adjusted the cost estimate, and then adjusted the performance specifications in ways described as threshold adjustments, but representing, in operational terms, a meaningful reduction in what the system would actually do compared to what it had been funded to deliver. By the time the program reached its critical test phase, it had accumulated a gravitational mass that made objective assessment structurally difficult. 12 prime contractors and over 200 subcontractors across 38 states. Senior Air Force officers whose professional reputations were tied to the program's success. Congressional delegations in every one of those states with constituents whose employment depended on the program advancing. This is the architecture that surrounds every major defense program, and it is precisely the architecture that makes honest assessment of a failing program the most institutionally difficult act an individual inside it can perform, because honest assessment in this environment doesn't just threaten careers, it threatens the livelihoods of thousands of people in dozens of congressional districts. And the political system that is supposed to provide oversight is the same system those thousands of people vote in. This is why the report was buried. Not malice, arithmetic. The program's technical ambitions were genuine. It attempted to integrate low observable shaping, advanced radar-absorbent materials, active electromagnetic signature management, and thermal suppression into a single airframe that was simultaneously required to carry a significant internal weapons load, achieve supersonic cruise without afterburner, and maintain a sensor fusion architecture allowing a single aircraft to perform missions that previously required multiple specialized platforms. Each requirement individually was at the edge of what existing engineering could deliver. Integrating all of them into a single, flyable operational system within the original timeline was, in the assessment of several senior aerospace engineers who have since spoken on record, not realistic given the state of the relevant technologies when the requirement was written. The program's response was not to revise the requirements, it was to revise the timeline. And here is the part that should make you genuinely uncomfortable. What happened in those congressional hearings wasn't lying. Everything the program officials said was technically accurate. A former program official described it precisely. We did not lie to Congress. Everything we said was technically accurate. We simply ensured that the technically accurate statements we chose to make were the ones that supported the program's continuation. The statements that would have supported a different conclusion were also technically accurate. We chose not to make them. Read that again. We chose not to make them. And the oversight system designed specifically to catch exactly this kind of selective disclosure failed to catch it for 6 years. The testing was not fraudulent. The testing was real. But the testing was designed over many iterations to test the system against requirements the system could meet, rather than requirements the operational environment would impose. The difference between those two things was measured in the end in $40 billion. The test that produced the classified report was not scheduled as the program's definitive evaluation. It was a routine developmental test, one of a series designed to demonstrate incremental progress. And the program had taken every available step to ensure conditions were as favorable as possible. The atmospheric conditions were optimal. The radar systems were operating in the modes the program had prepared for. The flight profile had been rehearsed multiple times. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled, and the test still lasted 11 minutes. The system lifted from the runway at 06:23 hours. The test range radar systems acquired it within 4 minutes. Engineers watching the data feeds saw the acquisition alert appear. There was a brief period where personnel attempted to determine whether the acquisition was real. It was. At minute 7, a valid missile engagement solution registered. At minute 9, a second. At minute 11, the test was terminated. Not by plan, by authority, because continuing had no value. Nobody spoke. Not immediately. The people in that room had spent years on this program, and the data was telling them something they had understood for a long time. It just hadn't been visible like this. Now it was, and it was unambiguous. The report took 3 weeks to prepare. Its conclusion was precise. The system cannot meet minimum survivability requirements. The gap is too large to fix within the current program. In simple terms, it doesn't work. We cannot make it work. Don't test it again. The report was classified at a level that restricted access. Technically appropriate, also convenient. It could not be reviewed by oversight staff. It could not be easily requested. It could not be leaked without serious consequences. It was not destroyed. It was filed in a place accessible only to those who knew exactly where to look. 3 months later, the program director testified before Congress. The report was not mentioned. The test was described as routine. No follow-up questions were asked. Funding continued, and the engineers returned to work for 18 more months on a system they knew could not be made to work, until an audit changed everything. The report surfaced 18 months later, not through a leak, through a routine audit. The audit found a reference to a classified test. The findings did not match the program's claims. The auditors requested the document. It was delayed, then partially provided, then fully disclosed. The auditors read the report, then the testimony, then the budget approval, and then they wrote the report that ended the program. The program was cancelled. Thousands lost their jobs. The officer who wrote the report was commended as evidence that the system worked. Eventually, after 18 months and $40 billion and 11 minutes. $40 billion. At the time, that was more than a full year of the Air Force's research budget for a system that didn't work. But the real cost is higher because of the delay. The capability came later, at greater cost, because resources were committed here first, and that cost has never been calculated, because calculating it would require acknowledging it. The lesson is not that the system is broken. The lesson is more uncomfortable. A system of rational decisions can produce irrational outcomes. Every person involved made decisions that made sense, individually, but together they produced failure. The test range doesn't care about any of that. It measures reality. And on that morning, reality lasted 11 minutes. $40 billion. 11 minutes. Don't test it again.